So now with that Electricity 4.0 backdrop, let's dive into a couple examples. You say, Stephen, digitization and AI can help me decarbonize. Is that really the case? Well, let's dive into net zero buildings first. If you look at a typical commercial office building, maybe spent some time in Canary Wharf or through the city, typically these buildings will use around 70% of their carbon emissions are released through operations, heating, cooling, management, etc., with 30% being embodied carbon emissions. That's that concrete, the steel, the materials, all of which required some sort of input and have carbon dioxide that it's embodied, that typically are categorized in those scope 3 emissions, which are really difficult to manage at times. So the challenge, almost a paradox, if you will, is that we need to focus on reducing operational emissions while without increasing the embodied carbon. And so very quickly we end up at a story around retrofits, because of course because today, if you look, it's estimated that 50% of the buildings that will be here in 2050 are already in use today. So that means that what's here is going to be being used for a long time, and that's not always the most efficient stock. If you look at a typical building, it's going to have a carbon intensity of around 2 megatons of carbon dioxide per square meter. Now, if you look at a brand new build with the most modern technology, from the materials itself, double pane windows, to the control and automation, that carbon intensity plummets to 0.6 megatons of carbon dioxide. But again, there's quite a bit of embodied carbon to build that. So in fact, a retrofit is where you can take an existing building, but instead of leaving it as is with the technology and materials, retrofit it so it's 0.3 megatons of carbon dioxide in a typical representative building. Which means that if you're able to retrofit a typical commercial building, you can have half of the carbon emissions of a brand new build, and in fact, a sixth of what you might call an existing building left unchanged. So retrofit is a key part of reaching net zero buildings. At this point, you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with digital and AI? We're talking about retrofitting, and that's a fair question. So where digital comes in is, how do we do this? You say retrofits, reduce carbon, how do we do it? Well, in fact, there are 10 steps, nice round number, to decarbonize buildings, categorized into strategize, digitize, and decarbonize. So there's clearly quite a bit to do, but I really want to zoom into number 4 here, which is reducing energy and carbon through automation. Now, buildings, they feel pretty static, but they're living, breathing entities. We feel it here with the air conditioning, heating, ventilation, security, access management. Utilizing modern building and power management systems is essential to have control of facilities. Space utilization data is typically underutilized in buildings. Very few of us go in an office now every day at 8 a.m. and leave at 5. That's not the world that we live in, so buildings are very dynamic, unpredictable, and challenging to manage at times, given the kind of mixed-use environment and hybrid workforce that we're in today. Optimizing equipment performance. If you can extend the life of assets, or you can make them run more efficiently, you're both helping you be more efficient with your operations, and you're reducing the carbon that would be required to refresh that equipment. All of these benefit from applying artificial intelligence. Given the complexity of a modern building, given the carbon intensity, applying AI to automate and control has a significant impact on the operations and carbon intensity of a building. We were curious exactly, of those 10 steps you saw, how much do they impact a given building? How much does automation and AI actually make a difference compared to all of the other potential retrofits that you can do for a building? And it's clear we worked with WSP, a leading consulting firm, to try to understand this dynamic. What you see are the operational carbon emissions of a given commercial building. And there are a number of ways that you can retrofit. You saw a few of them on that path to net zero buildings that we discussed. But in a light intervention that doesn't require that much investment relative to other possibilities for retrofit, you can see that automation and AI and measuring and controlling, if you can't read it, those are those first 2 bars right there, have a significant impact for relatively small investment in decarbonizing a building. Right there, you can see that we can reduce from 18.7 kilograms of carbon dioxide per year per square meter, over 8 between those two, 8.4 just between automating and applying AI to make your building run more efficiently. And then, of course, there are other things that you need to do to get it all the way to a net zero building. But it's very clear that you can quickly use automation and digital technologies to make a building run much more efficiently. So I want to jump into one more example, which is microgrid. Now, many of y'all in this room may be familiar with microgrid. It's effectively distributed energy resources that can island off of a grid. It can be small or large. It could be a solar array and batteries, or it could be a very large campus that uses massive solar implementation, battery energy storage systems, perhaps onboard hydrogen, all of which works as an intelligent system. And there are many benefits of a microgrid. You can get better economic performance because you can hedge against centralized fuel prices and go off-grid when that makes sense. You can bring more reliable infrastructure because now you have additional sources of energy beyond what you're getting from a utility provider. But most importantly for this conversation, it can be more sustainable because you're onboarding green energy sources and then you're deploying those as it makes most sense for your operations. Now, this obviously introduces a level of complexity into the management of a system like this. How do you know when to charge your batteries versus use energy from the grid directly? What about potentially selling energy back to the grid when it makes most sense and they need good, clean energy from your solar array, for example? How do you understand the tariff management system? And throughout all of that, how do you maintain resiliency? Because knowing that at any time, there could be an outage, as shown in this lovely animation right here, and you need to make sure that critical loads stay up while shedding additional loads to ensure that you can maintain efficiency and leverage your storage effectively. All of this, I just rattled through a number of decisions that have to be made as you're managing a microgrid. Decisions that really go beyond manual intervention and require automated, artificial intelligence to help make these decisions and make your data center run most effectively and, of course, most sustainably. And microgrid is one example, but this is really the world that we're entering with the modern grid, where prosumer, someone who produces and consumes, needs to be managed along an increasingly complex distribution and transmission ecosystem. So it's very important that we consider digital technologies and artificial intelligence to help manage grid infrastructure, both at the microgrid level and at an overall grid system level. And so finally, we get to the other side. All right, there are a few examples. Digital and AI is really, really important, but again, that clearly requires data centers, and it's clear that there's been significant growth in that market. How do we make these more efficient, reliable, safe, and sustainable? And again, it comes back to our Electricity 4.0 story. You can build a comprehensive strategy to reduce, to procure PPAs and make a data center more efficient, where the digital infrastructure industry has been actually leaders in onboarding new green supply. You can use digital technology to reduce embodied carbon in the build process. How do we use building information management through construction to make sure that we're making the right decisions to reduce the carbon intensity of a given building? And then finally, how do we use most efficient cooling systems to decarbonize a data center environment? But rather than me go on about this, I think it'd be helpful to hear directly from a data center provider who has been a leader in the sustainability space to show quickly how it is possible to run a data center more sustainably.
The Nordic countries are perfect for locating data centers. The electrical grid is very reliable and the energy is generated by 100% hydroelectric and wind power. My name is Mike Swanfeldt and I'm the Chief Technological Officer of EcoData Center. We are a provider of co-location and HPC services. We have a high focus on sustainability and security. EcoData Center will achieve climate positivity by reusing our waste heat in a low-grade system, meaning that we don't introduce heat pumps to increase the temperature. We will reuse the heat to feed a pellets factory producing biofuel, and by this we will compensate for electricity that we use in our data center. With the products coming from Schneider Electric, we expect to achieve a PUE of 1.15 Combining that with using hydroelectric power will make sure that we are one of the most sustainable data centers in the Nordics and hopefully in the world.
So as digital becomes increasingly important in our lives, it's critical to remember there's no digital without digital infrastructure. And that's one example of how we can make that much more sustainably. So there's no silver bullet. It's going to take a system, as you heard, which requires digital to manage most intelligently. And we believe that Electricity 4.0 is the fastest path to net zero. And maybe we can all support that by, after this, deleting a couple unused photos on our iPhones. So thanks.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. I have a very scientific way of judging how engaged an audience is in a presentation by how many phones come out to take pictures of the slides. I call it the phones outification ratio, and I think the phones outification ratio was at least 8.5 for that. So thank you very much indeed. Yeah. Right, let's actually see how engaged the audience were. Do we have any questions from the audience? I can come out with the mic. Do we have any hands going up? I can't see at the back. We do, yes. I will come and find you. I always have questions of my own, but I can guarantee the audience ones tend to be rather better. So, there we go.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. But you mentioned at the start the liquid cooling that data centers require. And I just wanted to get your view on how that can be made more sustainable, considering that the average data center uses the equivalent of 100,000 homes worth of water every single day.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so we are seeing the emergence of liquid cooling infrastructure in the data center space. I think it's important to remember that data centers are serving different workloads at different times. And so we do find environments today where you have a mixed air and liquid cool environment most commonly. So it's not going to be a dramatic shift to one architecture right out of the gate. So some of the fundamental performance standards that have been set for data centers will still benefit in a liquid-cooled environment. So you heard in the Eco Data Center video about their PUE, their power usage effectiveness, which was 1.15. That's effectively all the electricity coming into a facility divided by the electricity that's consumed by IT. So perfect would be 1. That's obviously impossible because you do need to apply some of that to cooling infrastructure. Water use is obviously a big focus area for data centers. There are data centers that are able to totally be water-free. Some of that's dependent on the geography in which they deploy. Liquid cooling will typically be a closed system with specialized fluids, so it shouldn't necessarily impact that water level right there. But this is a great example, again, about how it's a system, because sometimes if you want to be most efficient with electricity, that involves consuming a little bit more water. There are ways to go entirely water-free in a data center. So there's really not one-size-fit-all solution. But again, taking steps and hearing success stories like Eco Data Center show that it is possible to run a data center most efficiently. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question if there's anything else. One at the front.
Hi, my name's Jenny. This might seem like a naive question, but given that Amazon are about to build loads of data centers in the UK, that's kind of a little bit worrying for the UK. What regulation, if any, is actually in place to cause data center builders to be more sustainable? And also, what impact do data centers have on the local community?
No, that's a fantastic question. And obviously, as digital becomes part of our life, so do data centers. And I think the awareness of the industry is very helpful. That's why I make presentations like this, so it's no longer, and it doesn't have to be a mysterious solution in the background of society. I won't comment on specific regulation. I do think that commercial zoning laws typically do apply. There's the EU DCA, which is proposing certain standards of operation, including PUE metrics and water metrics, to make sure that they are that data centers are working, meeting certain standards that the industry and community both think are essential for it. And that comes back to kind of how do we monitor, measure, and manage a data center most efficiently. If you think about water use and electrical use regulation, a big piece of that is how do we connect and manage and understand how sustainable a data center really is. that again comes back to deploying the meters, the management, the software solutions to capture that information and then be able to demonstrate that, yes, in fact, this data center is running to point. But certainly data centers typically have been close to population centers to service the workloads that we're all using. I think with AI, we are seeing a decoupling where data centers can now be moved into more remote locations that should alleviate some of that concern.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed for your question, Stephen. Thank you. In just a moment, we'll be back with our first fireside chat of day 2, which is with Kevin Dunkley from HH Global. We're talking the conscious creative. But for now, a huge thank you to Stephen Brown from Schneider Electric.
Is that right?